This is Andrew Clendenin with the World of Texas Music. Today's episode will feature Pat Bywaters. Pat is an occasional DJ on radio station KNON in Dallas, Texas. Pat is also executive director of Encore Park in Dallas, Texas, the location of 508 Park Avenue, the building where Robert Johnson recorded his seminal work that changed the landscape of music. Pat Bywaters, welcome to the World of Texas Music. You spend a lot of your time literally walking around in music history in the building at 508 Park Avenue, Dallas, Texas. Robert Johnson, Eric Clapton, Bob Wills, Gene Autry, just to name a few, all recorded their music in this building. What year was the building constructed and why?
Well, it was built built for Warner Brothers as a film exchange, and they started construction in 1929 and wrapped it up in early 1930. Most interesting thing about that particular time frame is that at the end of 1929 we had the stock market crash.
Bad timing.
Yeah, they built another film exchange, a similar one, a two-story instead of ours is a three-story. But they built the two-story one in New Orleans, which is where the architects were originally from. But it was built to house silver nitrate film, so it's a very specifically purpose-built building. It was intended to be fire resistant, explosion proof, and passively ventilated. So
pretty sophisticated for days.
Very, yeah. And it was built in this little area of Dallas that at the time was called Film Row. By the 1920s and 30s, towns were tired of film exchanges catching fire and burning large sections of downtown. So, especially back when the buildings were predominantly wooden. So, what they tended to do was gradually move all the film exchanges out to a row, and there were new fire standards. You had, fire doors and sprinklers, and the structures had to be masonry, and we put them all in one spot. So, if anything was going to get burned down, you were all going to burn down together, and not burn the rest of us.
Tell us about the architecture of the building.
Well, it's from the first period of what later became known as Art Deco. It's known as Zigzag Moderne. Some of y'all may be familiar with the buildings at Fair Park, and that's the second period, which is streamlined, which is a little more abstract, and you start seeing large curves. But Zigzag Moderne is more right angles, and you see zigzag, and vertical surfaces tended to be jutted out to emphasize height. Some people, it's more commonly kind of known as skyscraper.
Fair Park is also located in Dallas, Texas. It's amazing the building is only about a 10-minute walk from Deep Ellum, the cradle of Dallas music history, where bluesmen Blind Willie Johnson, T-Bone Walker, Leadbelly, and Blind Lemon Jefferson played on the street corners. During the 1930s, what other music genres were prevalent in Dallas?
Oh gosh, everything was being played here. You had these what they called territory jazz bands that played at some of the hotels, like the Baker and such. There was blues going on in Deep Elm, as well as other things. I mean, there wasn't just blues going on down there. There was all sorts of popular music. There was Western swing was really getting started. It was known as hot string band in the 1930s. There was traditional cowboy music. There was just kind of popular music. That was kind of just this light stuff. There was a band that recorded at 508 Park called Roy Newman and his Boys that tended to kind of play more. They were kind of more in that pop genre, a little bit of kind of jazz and stuff kind of blended in.
So for the central part of the United States, this was somewhat of a music hub.
Yeah, most of the big record labels were coming down to this region and doing field recordings. Okay. There weren't real studios back in the 1930s, and so they'd bring the equipment down and set up in a hotel or otherwise and record for several weeks. They would have prearranged for bands to show up and cut those masters and then shipped them back. But there was a lot going on in Texas. I think music's just, there were lots of ethnic groups that came to Texas. Pretty much everybody here is from somewhere else, except for the Native Americans. Even the Hispanics that got here real early on were from somewhere else. So, but everybody brought their own musical heritage here. And back then you had to make a lot of your own entertainment. Even in the 1930s, radio was fairly new. So, records and hearing things maybe at the local tavern or club on the jukebox was still kind of a thing, even though radio was beginning to get more prevalent.
Where in the building did the recordings take place?
Actually, up on the third floor. So right after Warner Brothers opened the Film Exchange, they got in the record business, and they bought Brunswick Records from the guys that built bowling balls, all that. Yeah. Brunswick had gotten into the record business kind of incrementally. They first started building phonograph furniture for companies that sold phonographs, and then they started making their own full phonographs, and then they got in the recording business. And then at some point they were like, oh, this is getting a little too far afield. At just about the time Warner Brothers was like, oh, we want to put our movie stars on record. So they bought Brunswick in 1930 and moved the local Dallas office to the third floor of the 508 Park building. And so the producers were doing field recordings around, and the third floor was predominantly just offices and wholesale record warehouse is what was up there. The preferred kind of location for doing field recordings was to get a pair of hotel rooms that were next to each other, and you could put the engineer and producer in one room and then run the microphone cord to the microphone and have the musicians in the room next door. That just worked out real nicely. We believe that's what happened at the Gunner Hotel in 1936 when they recorded Robert Johnson and other bands.
The first time that Robert actually recorded in Texas, yeah.
And the recordings got started as the Depression started to worsen in Texas, and it took a few years for the worst of the Depression to hit Texas. I think I read somewhere that maybe the worst of it hit Texas in about 1935, but that part of having the Texas Centennial here was a deliberate attempt to stem the Depression, as well as to bring people to Texas. But we believe they started recording in the building, that it was really just an attempt to save money, because these recordings were being done, they were being issued on the kind of newly developed dime store labels, which in the 1920s, records usually sold for like $1 or $1.25, and they were really sold to the people that had significant money. Record players were fairly expensive, but they figured out how to manufacture the records where they could sell them 3 for $1 or 35 cents a piece. And so when they were doing these recordings, it was usually 2 quick takes, and then the masters were off to the pressing plant and get them out in jukeboxes as quick as you could and see what would sell.
Who were the individuals involved with the recording process at 508 Park Avenue?
Well, my understanding is the engineers at that time, Warner Brothers had sold the business to American Record Corp, and they were sending their engineers down from New York with the equipment. So they had the first time they did recordings was in 1935, and they just tried recording in the record warehouse at the back of the building on the third floor, and it was a little too reverberant. They tried hanging burlap. That didn't work quite as well as they wanted, and I think I remember hearing something about that they had some trouble with the heat. I think they were still using what were called the wax cakes for the masters.
Now tell us what a wax cake is.
Well, so you might have heard somebody say we waxed a record, and that's where that term comes from. So these were about an inch thick from what I understand, and they were used, one of the components in there was beeswax.
Okay.
And you could actually carve the master groove with the recording onto one of these wax cakes. They had an advantage in that they had a machine that you could cut the top surface off. And I think I remember hearing that you could do up to 5 recordings on a beeswax master, but they were a little unstable. And if you were recording down in hotter weather,
I've also heard,
well, it could be a problem. And from what I've heard is they pack them in ice to keep them cool, just to make sure that the recordings didn't, kind of warp or change.
Sure. So it was the high tech
right
of the day.
Well, and that actually led to, by 1935, though, about 1935, and we've got a picture of the 1936 recording session down at the Gunner Hotel. The picture actually shows the recording engineer holding what later became known as an acetate, and it was an aluminum disc coated in black nitrocellulose lacquer, and he's holding the disc, and the caption says that they're recording on the new technology.
On the new technology.
The new technology, yeah, a 78 acetate.
And what were the acoustics like? You're in basically a warehouse office type structure.
Right. Well, it wasn't great. Like I said, they tried in 35 putting burlap up, and it was still a little too reverberant in there. You know, it's got hard concrete floors, and there was a really hard, I don't even know if it was stucco. It's almost like, kind of like plaster lath, but maybe with concrete mixed in or something.
Right.
It was super hard. So for the 1937 sessions, they actually built what became known as the temporary studio. It was also referred to as the Beaverboard Room. And that's where they did the recordings when Johnson was there in 37. They did 2 sets of recordings there in 38 and then one last time in 39.
And who were the engineers or producers?
Well, the engineers came down from New York, from what we understand.
Do we know who they were?
No, we don't. One of the engineers, I believe, is named in that picture in San Antonio from 1936, and I don't recall his name. But by that time, by 35, Don Law had been promoted from being a staff accountant to being the A&R guy.
That's a big switch.
It was a big switch. But the interesting story there is there was a gentleman at Art who had come from England and had worked for Paramount, and his name was Art Satherley. And Art met Don Law, who was also from England. Who had
Englishmen.
Both Englishmen. And I guess I imagine they probably hit it off right away, and don't know what led to it, but Art promoted Don to being the regional guy. So Don was over both the Dallas and Atlanta offices for Brunswick Record Corp., which was a division of American Record Corp.
So he was present.
So he was present, and Art Satherley was present
okay.
At some of the recordings. There's a story about when Bob Wills came in, and I think it was the 35 sessions, the first time, and he started into the aha and the talking stuff.
Right.
And Satherley kind of burst in and said, "Whoa, wait a minute! What are you doing? You're ruining the recording."
Right.
And Bob kind of got incensed and said, "Well, if you don't want Bob Wills, we'll just pack up and leave." Well, they thank goodness they worked it out. They figured it out. Satherley had just never encountered that, his music experience. We all know that was part of what we all loved about Bob.
Of course. A giant in his own right. Do we know anything about the recording equipment?
Yeah, we do. We believe that the equipment was repurposed from the use of doing recordings for the early talkie movies in the 1920s. It went through a couple of different steps. In, I think, the early 30s, it was still, the equipment was weight-driven.
Yes.
It sat up pretty high, and you'd actually crank up a weight, and because that gave you a very steady force on the I guess you call that the platen. We had already made the switch in the 20s from what they called acoustically recorded recordings, which is where people were basically singing as loud or playing their instruments as loud as they could down megaphones, which went directly to a diaphragm that made the needle cut the groove in the record. So we'd already transitioned to what they called electrically recorded, which was with microphones and an amplifier sending the signal to the cutter head.
Did we know how many microphones they used typically? And what type of mics were there? One mic?
There was one mic. And it went to basically an amplifier, and it was the engineer's job to make sure that the right amount of energy, that you had the right amount of gain going to the cutter head, because you didn't want to cut the groove too aggressively, but you didn't want to cut it too timidly. So you wanted the right depth there. So the lathes actually had a microscope on.
Really?
Yeah, where you could inspect the groove to see that you were getting an appropriate amount of cut. But the equipment... one of the transitions first in the 30s was from weight-driven to DC motors. And as I understand it, wall current wasn't real consistent back then. The first step was they actually drove the DC motors off of batteries. And then at some point later on, they made the full switch to wall current.
So we really had some technological advances.
Yeah,
that
there was a lot going on there.
Improves the actual recording process.
Mm-hmm. And there's other things that are past my level of competency that there's probably maybe a handful of guys here in the United States that can talk to it. They're very interesting to talk to.
I bet. How many songs were recorded in the building?
843.
My gosh. Who were some of the other artists that recorded there?
There was quite a few Hispanic bands. Lalo Cavazos, who was an early conjunto player. And if you're not familiar with conjunto, it's you kind of think of it as, I might get this wrong, but I kind of think of it as border honky-tonk. It was primarily, early conjunto was accordion with a baja sexto, which is a type of 12-string, kind of a 12-string guitar, tuned a bit differently. There was another band that got famous in the 40s, a little bit famous in the 40s, Gaetani Cantu. There were other African-American groups that recorded there. There was a great woman named Kitty Gray and her Wampus Cats.
Great name.
I love her stuff. There was a couple piano players, both very talented. One went by the name of Black Boy Shine. His real name was Harold Holliday. He was from Houston. And then there's this other guy that we know very little about named Dusky Daly, and I really like his stuff. It was piano, it was more pop than blues, but very talented.
So a wide horizon of genres.
Yeah, very much so.
The story of the iconic bluesman Robert Johnson is a mixture of fact, legend, and myth. We do know that he lost his first wife and child during childbirth. His second wife also died shortly after they were married. Certainly reason for the artist to feel emotional pain. He's supposedly associated with Son House and Charlie Patton, both renowned bluesmen. Is it correct that there are only a few known photographs of Robert Johnson?
Yeah, there's two that everybody agrees. There was a third photograph that surfaced that was supposedly a young picture of him with Johnny Shines, but I think that may have
been doctored.
Well, I think people finally decided that it probably wasn't.
Okay.
Somebody said there was also something about maybe there was a short film clip that they thought maybe was Johnson, but there was a piece of evidence in the background that proved it was from the 40s. And of course, Johnson died in 1938.
Right.
9 months after he recorded in Dallas.
So he's a mysterious character.
Yeah, and I think he I would say played that up or agitated or aggravated that as much as possible. Yeah, from what I have read, yeah, he was a bit of a mysterious figure.
He worked a mystique.
Yeah, he would disappear on people or say he'd be one place and then he wouldn't show.
And he moved around a lot. Chicago, St. Louis.
Yeah.
And worked the Delta.
Yeah, other musicians said they would run into him, periodically, and then he'd say, "Oh, I'll see you tomorrow night," and then he wouldn't show up. He'd be off somewhere else.
What year did Johnson record at 508 Park?
So that was 1937. He actually recorded on. Interesting fact: he recorded first day was Juneteenth. So June 19th and 20th. It just happened that there was a big Juneteenth celebration going on down at Fair Park, and Bill Robinson, Mr. Bojangles, was one of the performers over there. So we've often wondered, did Robert happen to wander over to Fair Park while he was here?
We'll never know.
But we really don't. We really don't know. Someone sent me some evidence indicating that he was on the guest list that he'd stayed at the downtown YMCA.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know. We're going to have to dig on that a little bit more.
That would be interesting.
The only other story I have of from Dallas is I talked with Don Law Jr., the son, who lives up in Boston, and he says he remembers his mom talking about how they were walking through downtown Dallas, and Robert was walking kind of behind him, and Don Law Sr.'s wife was from Dallas. Of course, he was from England. And he was trying to talk to Robert and trying to get Robert to walk, kind of, what are you doing? Come up here. I'm trying to talk to you. And she had to remind her husband that, with Jim Crow kind of in place, that Robert was trying to avoid getting in trouble because that's not something you did at the time. But I do find it, interesting that, the Englishman here in Texas is, to him, I think he saw the musicians very differently than probably the other producers that were in the region, just because of his background, having grown up over in England and just a whole different exposure to music and
a completely different culture, obviously, that he brought. What prompted Johnson to come to Texas for his recording sessions?
Well, there was a talent scout. I believe the guy's name was Ernie Ottle that had found Johnson, and for some reason, Ottle wanted Don Law to do the recording. And so Johnson was sent here. That was very unusual because they were moving the equipment around all over the country, and Johnson could have easily been recorded somewhere much closer. I mean, rather than going to the expense of having to pay to get Johnson all the way to Dallas and San Antonio. So that was an exception that they decided to travel a musician that far. But for some reason, it was going to be important that Don Law handle Johnson.
An amazing trip,
and that's really all we know. We know Johnson got in a little bit of trouble in San Antonio.
He was thrown in jail,
first
right?
Night. I can't remember. There was something about he interrupted Don at his dinner with Don and his wife were at dinner, and he needed a little bit of money to pay a lady for some services. I think supposedly. Yeah, it's interesting to think. I don't know if Johnson had ever been to Texas before, if he'd ever come. I know, he made these two trips here, first to San Antonio in 36 and then to Dallas in 37. And Don Law was planning on bringing him back, but of course that never happened. That never got to happen.
Yeah, even John Hammond had discovered him and was planning to have him perform at Carnegie Hall.
Right, yeah.
Unfortunately, he died before that ever took place.
Right.
How many songs did he record in Dallas and San Antonio?
Oh, gosh, I'm going to get it's something in the neighborhood of like 23 songs, plus alternate take.
Is there a difference in the recordings that you can tell?
Well, one of the biography, one of the guys that's written a Johnson biography, Elijah Wald, says if you listen closely to San Antonio and the alternate takes there at San Antonio versus the takes in Dallas and the alternates, you can tell that Johnson is much more certain of himself and certain of what he's doing because there's less variation between the first and second takes. And just the feel of the song, Johnson seemed to be more confident in what he was doing. One of the challenges of doing recording back then is that you had to be aware of where you were in the recording because the disc was going to run out of space.
Only so many minutes.
Right. And so, you wanted to use it, but you couldn't go over.
Right.
It's not like you had an endless reel of tape running there.
Or a digital.
Yeah, or digital. I guess tape's not completely endless. But, so that's what I would tell people is, sit down and listen to the original and the alternates in San Antonio and listen to the original and alternates in Dallas and see what you think.
And presumably, this was the first recording sessions he'd ever been in.
Yeah, as far as we know, nobody's ever produced any other recordings.
So he walked in off the street and boom, here we go.
Well, he knew he was coming to record.
Right.
Yeah.
But as far as the experience of recording, this is something completely new to him.
Right.
What is your personal take on the man known as Robert Johnson?
He's, I think it's kind of, there's kind of like with, I think, for all of us, there's aspects of our lives that are tragic and uplifting and inspiring, and I think there's a little bit of all of us there. In Johnson's life, and there's lessons too. People, the whole thing around selling his soul to the devil. I mean, you could kind of say, well, he kind of did. He
at the crossroads.
Well,
the famous story of Robert Johnson
at the
crossroads.
I think playing all that up is kind of like playing with fire, and it eventually caught up with him. Supposedly being poisoned back in Mississippi by a jealous husband.
So you think he knew what he was doing from a marketing standpoint, I guess, for the times?
I think he did.
Okay.
I think he did. I don't think he was just kind of out of control. I think he knew what he was doing. But he was carrying a heavy burden. I mean, he had been his
first wife, mentioned,
she was the daughter of a pastor, as I understand it, and he was shunned from the community and told that the child and his wife had died because he played the devil's music.
Second wife died shortly after they were married. A lot of pain and agony. Actually.
Yeah, there is a lot of pain and agony there. And I'm sure he was probably angry, and maybe some of kind of embracing this devil kind of thing was just part of the anger that he carries. It's hard to know. Boy, you just there's times I have sat up in that building at night, all by myself up on the third floor. And they're like, "Man, Robert, if you could talk to me right now."
And the breeze is blowing through the windows.
Oh my!
Yeah,
that place is just it's a piece of magic.
Let's go there. On his first day of recording, what do you think Johnson may have experienced walking down the street, entering 508 Park Avenue, and going to the third floor?
Well, he would have encountered the musicians that were finishing up. There was a guy named Zeke Williams. I think that there was two groups, I think, recorded on the 19th in the morning. Johnson, I believe, was there kind of roughly afternoon, at least in the recording order. And Zeke was a cowboy singer. He actually recorded a song called something Breeze, like "Baby Breeze Blow My Baby Back to Me,"
Great title.
Which was a minor hit. So he probably, he might have gotten there and, kind of like at any studio, you might have been waiting for the guys to get their instruments packed up and get out of the way, and
maybe nervous,
maybe a
Strange
little nervous.
Town.
Yeah, he probably hadn't met Don Law yet. He's just been told where to go. And there is a story so the Light Crust Doughboys recorded the morning of the second day, and their banjo player, a guy named Smokey Montgomery, said that he had remembered passing a black gentleman with a guitar case in the staircase.
Uh-huh.
Now we assume, and he does too, because he recounted that people would always ask him, was it Johnson? Did you stop and talk to him? And he's like, well, if I'd known he was going to get so famous, yeah,
Sure.
I might have, but he was just some other, he's just some other dude with a guitar coming in to record. Yeah, I think it would have been, and not unlike when he was at the Gunner Hotel. I mean, there were other musicians around, and people were waiting their turn, and you were hearing different styles of music maybe than you had heard, and thinking about getting mentally prepared, probably just like going into the studio.
What's going to happen?
What's going to happen? What's going to happen? What's it going to be like?
Was Johnson paid for his recordings?
Yes. I can say this. There was two ways that people tended to get paid. Some people took their money up front and just turned the rights over to the record company, and other people took a royalty. And there was in all of those 843 recordings, there was some of both of them going on.
Do we know whether he took cash or?
Well, I mean,
royalty.
I'm fortunate I know.
Oh, you do?
Just because I had the opportunity. Sony was nice enough to let me come up to their archives.
Okay.
And they still have all the original paperwork. There was a piece of paper that was basically forms the database. Oh, this was an amazing trip. They still have all 843 pieces of paper for every master that was cut in Dallas. They have them for San Antonio as well, and Fort Worth, and all the stuff that Don Law was recording. But we got permission to go up there and make high-res scans of all those, but they asked us to keep the royalty information confidential.
Okay. All right. So but you can't tell us.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think I would guess, knowing what I know about Don Law, Johnson had his choice.
Okay. So, and
I don't think he was told how it was going to be. I've had some people speculate, and I said, based on what I know about Don Law and Art Satherley, I don't think that was the case.
So they were supportive of the artist, obviously.
Very. And there's stories about how Don Law was very supportive of artists and tended to give them more, a lot of say-so. I mean, sometimes the artist would ask Don Law, what do you want us to do here? And he's like, you're the artist.
You do it.
Yeah. He's largely credited with keeping honky-tonk music alive during the Nashville period. Yeah, that he let a lot of the artists continue to record just, hard fiddles and lap steel, when a lot of that was going by the wayside at Decca and RCA Records. It was alive and well at Columbia.
Because of him.
Because of him. Yeah.
Because he moved to Nashville, right? Ultimately.
Eventually, yeah. I've been told he was told to move to Nashville.
Okay, enough of this. Get out.
Yeah. Well, he was recording here in Dallas with a recording engineer named Jim Beck, who apparently was this brilliant guy in the 1940s. That's the post story to 508, but largely untold.
It's fascinating. I've read that Johnson literally faced the corner of the room while recording. Do you think that was the actual recording setup?
No. My guess is, well, first of all, that story is associated with San Antonio. Okay. And there's a couple of different reasons. Some people say, oh, he was trying to get an acoustic effect and that he actually moved the microphone over. And, I imagine the recording engineers were pretty particular.
Yes.
And they were trying to get this stuff done quickly. So they're probably, the artists, even though Don Law probably allowed the artists some leeway, there probably wasn't a lot of time for messing. The other thing that was speculated was, actually, there's two more things that were speculated about San Antonio. One was that Johnson wanted to turn his back so that the Hispanic musicians that were there couldn't see how he was playing. And who knows? It was Johnson's first time in the studio. It's plausible. He might have done that. It could have been both reasons. You know,
sure.
People, they say, what is it? Airplanes don't fall out of the sky for one reason.
Right.
So Johnson may have had several reasons for kind of sticking the microphone in the corner and playing that way. I don't think there would have been that reason to do that in Dallas because he would have been sitting in the Beaverboard room all by himself.
So a more advanced acoustically treated room.
I mean, it's possible. There's one other story floating around out there about did they speed up or slow down the recordings.
Mm-hmm. You'd think they wouldn't because of the technology of the day was limited.
Well, it's possible that they could have. I have never heard of that technique being used with any other ARC recordings that were done during that time frame.
Okay.
So if you look at all the other Western swing bands and the Hispanic bands and all that, I've never heard anybody say that those recordings were sped up or slowed down in order to adjust pitch or something like that. So I don't tend to believe that story about the Johnson recordings.
Interesting for speculation.
Yeah.
For sure. We talked about this a little, or we mentioned this a minute ago. Tell us more about the Crossroads story.
Oh, gosh. I'm really not the right person to ask about that. The Crossroads it is a place in Mississippi. You can go visit. I guess you can go there and maybe get down on your own knees and see what happens. I don't know that I would tempt fate.
Right.
It's a metaphor. I mean, for having that moment of truth about who we're going to be or where we're going
So the crossroads literally for him in his life, where he was going to go. But also, supposedly, he wasn't a very good player, and then disappeared. And
right.
Supposedly this is the Crossroads event, and he meets the devil and trades his soul for his ability to become virtuoso on the guitar.
Yeah, I think it's been documented that I forget the gentleman's name, who he spent a significant amount of time with over that year working and practicing, and that they had met. They used to meet in some cemetery somewhere.
Appropriate.
And and practice. And I think Johnson some people said, oh, well, he couldn't have gotten that much better in just a year or
right.
whatever it was. But, if it's a person that's got real talent, real natural talent, I think that can happen.
Of course.
Yeah.
And we don't know. He might have been really good before this year or whatever it was that he was gone and came back.
It may, a lot of people, if you're somewhat self-taught,
mm-hmm.
you can develop some bad habits.
Sure.
And sometimes it just takes somebody to unwind some of that. And then all of a sudden everything falls into place and you make huge advances forward in your talent. So I think I could see it happening.
Yeah, and this was basically Son House, I think, saying that Robert would show up at gigs and really couldn't play the guitar very well. And then all of a sudden
beforehand.
He goes off. Yeah, and then all of a sudden he goes off, and of course this part of the story comes out of that.
Yeah, and if you're really focused and that's all you're doing day in and day out.
Sure.
Yeah,
and that's probably what he was doing. Supposedly Keith Richards first heard Johnson, and he asked who was the other guy playing with him. I think that's certainly a tribute to his virtuosity.
I think I've heard Eric Clapton say that you almost need two people to play Robert Johnson correctly.
Well, that says something.
Yeah.
If you have these type folks talking about his guitar playing, which is pretty spectacular, obviously.
The video that Clapton shot in the building in 2004 when he was here in Dallas to do the first Crossroads Guitar Festival, he had Doyle Bramall too with him.
Oh, really?
Playing together, and
Okay.
they really sound great. Of course, it sounds different than Johnson, but yeah, Johnson did have a way of kind of, however he was moving his fingers, he did have a kind of a mysterious way of playing that makes it sound like there's almost two folks going at it.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
You mentioned this a moment ago, the devil's music. Can you be a little bit more? Tell us a little bit more about that.
I don't know the whole history on how it got associated as being the devil's music, other than some of the lyric content could be risque. I mean, there's this whole segment of music called hokum that goes way back. That's kind of explicit lyric type music. Y'all can go Google hokum music. There's some compilations out there that are pretty amazing. I think Yazoo Records might have done some of those compilations of hokum, and just that it was associated with juke joints and drinking and partying and all that, and so
thus the devil's music. People can do. You can take any art form, and I kind of subscribe to the Star Wars view of it. Oh yes,
which is
what is that?
There's the Force out there, and there's a dark side and there's a light side, and you can use the Force for either. So music to me inherently is not devil or non-devil. It's all it's all what you do with it.
Sure.
And we could have a philosophical discussion about why there's a choice there.
Well, and this music was different for the time.
Yeah.
So I think anything different sometimes is not warmly received, and it.
Yeah, I don't know that they were referring to Johnson's music necessarily as being. I mean, there was other blues musicians that were doing this, and like I said, that hokum style I believe goes back even decades, even before Johnson, and people probably would have considered it devil's music. Certain people would have.
Well, the label's there.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
Yeah.
Why do you think Johnson's music is so compelling?
Well, it's very different, and it's very stripped down.
Indeed.
And it got compelling kind of for two reasons. One, because of British blues revivalists and Dylan. So Johnson's one of those guys that was kind of a musician's musician.
Yes.
Right? It was the musicians that really grabbed onto it. I mean, I came to Johnson through Eric Clapton. That's how I found out about Johnson. And I think the vast majority of us came to Johnson that way. We heard about it through
some other means,
some other musician who had heard his music and said, "Wow, that's
right."
That and those kind of folks are real interesting to me. You know, there's singer-songwriter guys that are like that people have recorded tons of their songs, and but they've never really had anything hit commercially on their own, and you just have these musicians. They're just kind of a category out there, and they're really fascinating. Well, and then the other thing that made it compelling more broadly was the whole the stories, the myth and the legends, and just the combination of that. Great. At some point I started saying something about on tours in the building about, music's kind of this river where you just you take some water out and you take a dip out and you put some back in at some point.
Yes, I've heard that.
And and I think musicians know that there is no original composition. We're all kind of taking things in and then reforming it in maybe some novel way, but it's all built on the folks that came before. And so I think, any artists are generally pretty good at saying, talking about who influenced them and why that was important in their lives.
And just the experiences that Robert Johnson went through.
Yeah.
Just a lot of pain and agony, like a lot of loss. Apparently not having any roots, that he traveled so much. And just as you said, he came and went as he wanted to, did kind of what he wanted to do.
There's if people want to check something out, Yazoo Records did a compilation called Roots of Robert Johnson.
Okay.
Where they picked songs, I think predominantly from the 20s, that had some parallel kind of sound to a Johnson tune.
That'd be interesting.
And it's very fascinating to sit down and go through that and listen to the Yazoo tune, whoever it's by, whether it's a Son House tune or whatever,
right.
and then listen to the Johnson tune.
Well, I do know that they would copy one another's songs and change the lyrics and change the guitar parts. So it's hard to tell what was really original, who actually wrote what.
Elijah Wall said that what's really unique about Johnson was the rhythm pattern that he had.
Yes.
That was unique.
Yes.
That Johnson was really the first guy to do that.
A lot of syncopation.
That became kind of the foundation of a lot of music that was to come. But one of the things we have to keep in mind was that Johnson's recordings only had kind of some limited success, and that it was not widely played. And so Johnson's influence really lay dormant. I mean, a lot of folks think that just because these recordings were out there that he was influencing all the musicians that came along in the 40s and 50s. No, really not. He kind of leapt from the 1930s straight into 1961, whenever it was, when
the first release of
when the Columbia release was done, and Dylan and Clapton and the Stones and various others heard it. From there on, it was a big influence.
Right. So it was incubating at that time.
Yeah, it was just, and that's just another real interesting part of the story.
Well, a lot of artists have to die and then they become famous. So here we go, Robert Johnson. Tell us your strangest story about an event or a visitor to 508 Park Avenue.
Oh, wow. I've had people from all over the world.
It's a pilgrimage for a lot of people.
It really is. Yeah, I've had a gentleman. He goes by Tokyo, Mississippi. Originally from Japan, spent a lot of time in L.A. He used to learned to play blues guitar at this club owned by this African American lady in L.A. And she gave him his name, Tokyo, Mississippi. You can find him on Facebook. A good player. He was so thrilled that I had a guitar. We went up on the third floor.
And he played.
Oh, and he played, yeah.
Oh, boy.
That wasn't strange, but it was just a lot of fun.
That is cool.
I had 12 Australians.
Uh-huh. A busload.
Yeah, they were doing a tour. They were doing a music tour, and they were tracing the roots of Robert Johnson. So they started in Mississippi, and then they came over to Dallas, and then they were going to do a stopover in Austin, and then go to San Antonio and see the Gunner Hotel. And they were just thrilled to get come. Oh, I had a 78 collector who is pretty well known in those circles that lived out in a suburb of L.A. He and his wife were going to visit some of her family, I think in Kansas, and they made a special trip to come through Dallas. And he'd actually met Bob Wills when Bob Wills was, I think, almost on his deathbed. He had some kind of opportunity presented itself that he got to meet Bob before he died. Boy, that was a thrill to get to take that guy, because this guy was.
He knew his stuff.
He really knew his music. Yeah. And he had visited some other famous 78 kind of era recording sites. And he's passed on since then, but it was a real privilege to get to take him on a tour. I don't know that I've had anything strange happen yet.
Okay.
It's all really been pretty great. I had some local musicians up there. We had a show going on in the amphitheater, and several of them broke away and said, "Hey, can we go for a tour?" And we went up there and we were listening to Robert Johnson, and one of them goes, "Man, this is kind of like church." And one of the other guys says, "What do you mean like church? This is church."
It's a temple.
I'd have to agree with it.
Yeah,
I mean, it
sure.
really is. It still gives me chills to go up there and listen to some of the music that was recorded there.
Are there any ghost stories about 508 Park Avenue?
No.
None whatsoever?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet.
Not yet.
But it's interesting to be up there on the third floor at night with the lights out.
I'm sure. Very interesting.
I've done that a couple of times.
That's worth a nighttime tour.
Yeah, so it would be.
What is your favorite Johnson song?
Well, it's going to have to be one of the Dallas recordings.
Of course.
I don't play San Antonio recordings in the building. Not that there's anything wrong with them. It's just we've got limited time.
Right.
It just wouldn't be right. I really like Love in Vain a lot.
Hard to beat.
I really like that one a lot. But the most compelling song, I think, So I'm giving you two answers. The most compelling one is Hellhound on My Trail.
Says a lot.
Oh, my gosh. And the fact that he was poisoned and died 9 months later.
Right.
It's giving me the feeling right now. I don't know. Did he know? Did he know that he had just pushed the legend too far?
Maybe. We'll never know.
We won't know. We don't, and how intentional it was or not. You don't know. But there's a lesson there for us all.
We assume he knew he was on the edge, dancing on the edge most of his adult life, just for his environment, what he was doing.
Yeah, I mean, it garnered attention. That's the thing, and that's a commentary that I don't know that has really changed about our society. Is why do we pay attention to that? Why do we reward that kind of stuff?
Good question. The media likes it for sure. So.
Well, it sells soap, right?
You bet.
Oh, this is just a dream for me. I don't know how it was. I was standing kind of in the wrong place at the right time when somebody said, "Hey, did you know that First Presbyterian Church in the Stew Pot bought the 508 building?" And I wheeled around and said, "What? Do they know what they bought?"
Pat Bywaters, thank you so much for being part of the world of Texas music.